Chapter 7 of The Wreck of the Titan. In the previous chapter, Chapter 6, we have John Rowland, our protagonist. He is hallucinating. He is spiraling downhill in a vicious cycle of thoughts that are just driving him deeper into depression, and at the same time he has been drugged. At the end of the chapter, we find the ship colliding with a cliff face of ice, 100 feet tall, which would be most likely taller than the highest deck of the ship, and panic has broken out immediately. He also finds himself holding Myra, the young daughter of the girl he once loved, and, according to his soliloquies, still loves, and is still obsessed with, actually. Chapter 7 of The Wreck of the Titan. 75,000 tons dead weight rushing through the fog at a rate of 50 feet a second had hurled itself into an iceberg. Had the impact been received by a perpendicular wall, the elastic resistance of bending plates and frames would have overcome the momentum, with no more damage to the passengers than a severe shaking up, and to the ship than the crushing in of her bows, and the killing to a man of the watch below. She would have backed off, and slightly down by the head, finished the voyage at reduced speed to be rebuilt on insurance money, and benefit largely in the end by the consequent advertising of her indestructibility. Now, of course, modern forensics will tell us that a ship of that weight traveling at that speed with that much momentum behind her would simply break her back. No matter how well she is built, she would not survive that. At the time, they did not know that. At the time of the Titanic, they did not know that. But a low breach, possibly formed by a recent overturning of the berg, interesting, supposedly Titanic's iceberg had recently overturned, received the Titan, and with her keel cutting the ice like a steel runner of an ice boat, and her great weight resting on the starboard bilge, she rose out of the sea higher and higher until the propellers in the stern were half exposed, then meeting an easy spiral rise in the ice under her port bow, she heeled, overbalanced, and crashed down on her side to starboard. So, she hits on the starboard side. Am I interpreting that correctly? The starboard side of the ship is what is damaged. Although it seems like she falls off the ice, rolling onto her starboard side, which makes me think she's actually rising up on the port. It's a little confusing, but unlike the Titanic, she actually climbs up. Her propellers come out of the water, half exposed, and then she rolls off, slapping down onto her side. Very different from the Titanic, but the Titanic is debated to have grounded on the iceberg a little bit, rolling over a submerged ledge. So the grounding could be potentially similar, but the sheer violence of the fact that the ship is pulled out of the sea, rides up, mostly up onto the iceberg, and then flips over onto her side, starboard side, and now rests there, is significantly different from the Titanic. And if I am not mistaken, the Titan should sink incredibly quickly. With that amount of damage, with the author being such an experienced sailor, I believe his bio said he was a sailor at one point, he knows the ship would go down in 10 minutes. So let's see. The holding down bolts of 12 boilers and 3 triple expansion engines, unintended to hold such weights from the perpendicular flooring, snapped, and down through a maze of ladders, gratings, and 4.5 bulkheads came these giant masses of steel and iron, puncturing the sides of the ship, even where backed by solid resisting ice, and filling the engine and boiler rooms with scalding steam, which brought a quick, though tortured, death to each of the 100 men on duty in the engineers department. Amid the roar of escaping steam and the bee-like buzzing of nearly 3,000 human voices, raised in agonizing screams and calling from within the enclosing walls, and the whistling of air through hundreds of open deadlights as the water, entering the holes of the crushed and riven starboard side, expelled it, the Titan moved slowly backward and launched herself into the sea, where she floated low on her side, a dying monster, groaning with her death wound. A solid pyramid-like hummock of ice, left to starboard as the steamer ascended, and which projected close alongside the upper or boat deck as she fell over, had caught in succession every pair of davits to starboard, bending and wrenching them, smashing boats and snapping tackles and gripes, until, as the ship cleared herself, it capped the pile of wreckage strewing the ice in front of and around it, with the end and broken stanchions of the bridge. And in this shattered box-like structure, dazed by the sweeping fall through an arc of 70-foot radius, crouched Roland, bleeding from a cut in his head, and still holding to his breast the little girl, now too frightened to cry. By an effort of will, he aroused himself and looked, to his eyesight twisted and fixed to a shorter focus by the drug he had taken. The steamship was little more than a blotch on the moon-whitened fog. So a moon is out, unlike when the Titanic went. Yet he thought he could see men clamoring and working on the upper davits, and the nearest boat, number 24, seemed to be swinging by the tackles. Then the fog shut her out, though her position was still indicated by the roaring of steam from her iron lungs. This ceased in time, leaving behind it the horrid humming sound and whistling of air, and when this too was suddenly hushed, and the ensuing silence broken by dull, booming reports as from bursting compartments, Roland knew that the Holocaust was complete, that the invincible Titan, with nearly all of her people unable to climb vertical floors and ceilings, was beneath the surface of the sea. So the sinking is obviously very different from the Titanic in 1912. In fact, to me, it almost sounds more like a combination between the Lusitania and the Empress of Ireland, while still taking a lot of creative license here, because I can't think of any ship where it rolled up and then tumbled off. I would say similar to the Lusitania in that half of her lifeboats were outright disabled by the ice, shearing them off of the deck. Now, obviously in a very different way on the Lusitania, simply by the fact that she was leaning too far to the side. But Empress of Ireland, by the fact that she just rolled on her side, and now people who were trapped inside of her couldn't climb up and get out. So this is not at all like the Titanic. I had seen online quite often that that the reason so many people on the Titan, the fictional Titan, had died was because of the lack of lifeboats. This is obviously not the case. No matter how many lifeboats were on board the Titan, there's no way they could have gotten them off. Half are disabled outright, and then the ship sank way too fast to actually get any more away. Maybe a couple, but certainly not enough for everybody. So when people say the Titan also sank and a lot of people died because there weren't enough lifeboats for everybody, that's clearly one of those cases where they're just trying to over-dramatize the similarities. There are similarities. No one can deny that. But people like to overdo that. Mechanically, his bumbled faculties had received and recorded the impressions of the last few moments. He could not comprehend to the full the horror of it all. Yet his mind was keenly alive to the peril of the woman, whose appealing voice he had heard and recognized, the woman of his dream, and the mother of his child in his arms. He hastily examined the wreckage. Not a boat was intact. Creeping down to the water's edge, he hailed with all the power in his weak voice to possible but invisible boats beyond the fog, calling on them to come and save the child, to look out for a woman who had been on deck under the bridge. He shouted this woman's name to one that he knew, encouraging her to swim to tread water, to float on wreckage, and to answer him until he came to her. There was no response, and when his voice had grown hoarse and futile, and his feet numb from the cold of the thawing ice, he returned to the wreckage, weighed down and all but crashed by the blackest desolation that had, so far, come into his unhappy life. The little girl was crying, and he tried to soothe her. "I want Mama," she wailed. "Hush, baby, hush," he answered wearily and bitterly. "So do I. More than heaven. But I think our chances are about even now. Are you cold, little one? We'll go inside and I'll make a house for you." He removed his coat, tenderly wrapping the little figure in it, and with the injunction, "Don't be afraid now," placed her in the corner of the bridge, which rested on its forward side. As he did so, the bottle of whiskey fell out of his pocket. It seemed an age since he had found it there, but it required a strong effort of reasoning before he remembered its full significance. Then he raised it, to hurl it down the incline of ice, but stopped himself. "I'll keep it," he said. "It may be safe in small quantities, and we'll need it in this ice." He placed it in a corner. Then, removing the canvas cover from one of the wrecked boats, he hung it over the open side and end of the bridge, crawled within, and donned his coat, a ready-made slop-chest garment designed for a larger man, and buttoning it around himself and the little girl, lay down on the hard woodwork. She was still crying, but soon, under the influence of the warmth of his body, ceased and went to sleep. Huddled in a corner, he gave himself up to the torment of his thoughts. Two pictures alternatively crowded his mind. One, that the woman of his dream, entreating him to come back, which his memory clung to as an oracle. The other, of this woman, cold and lifeless, fathoms deep in the sea. He pondered on her chances. She was close to or on the bridge steps, and boat number 24, which he was almost sure was being cleared away as he looked, would swing close to her as it descended. She could climb in and be saved, unless the swimmers from doors and hatches would swamp the boat. And in his agony of mind, he cursed these swimmers, preferring to see her mentally, the only passenger in the boat, with the watch on deck to pull her to safety. The potent drug he had taken was still at work, and this, with the musical wash of the sea on the icy beach, and the muffled creaking and crackling beneath and around him, the voice of the iceberg, overcame him finally, and he slept, to waken at daylight, with limbs stiffened and numb, almost frozen. And all night, as he slept, a boat with the number 24 on her bow, pulled by sturdy sailors and steered by brass-buttoned officers, was making for the southern lane, the highway of spring traffic. And crouching in the stern sheets of this boat was a moaning, praying woman who cried and screamed at intervals for husband and baby and would not be comforted, even when one of the brass-buttoned officers assured her that her child was safe in the care of John Rowland, a brave and trusty sailor who was certainly in the other boat with it. He did not tell her, of course, that Rowland had hailed from the berg as she lay unconscious, and that if he still had the child, it was with him there, deserted. End of chapter 7. So now he's on an iceberg, and he's got a kid with him. Myra's okay, though. She's in a lifeboat. She's making it out to the sea lanes. We'll see what happens next.